When my new boss, Marcus Sterling, walked into the conference room on Monday morning and announced that my position was being eliminated effective immediately, I sat there in stunned silence as he handed me a termination letter. What he said next about restructuring and fresh perspectives made me realize he had absolutely no idea who I was or what I had built for this company. The look of smug satisfaction on his face as he dismissed me like some expendable employee vanished completely when I quietly stood up and told him exactly what would happen to DataFlow Solutions when I walked out that door. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning started like any other Tuesday in my 4 years at DataFlow Solutions, except it wasn't just any Tuesday. It was Marcus Sterling's first official day as our new Chief Technology Officer, and everyone in the Seattle office was buzzing with nervous energy about what changes he might bring to our small but successful data analytics company. I arrived at the office at 7:30, just as I had every morning for the past 4 years, carrying my usual large coffee and checking emails on my phone as I walked through the glass doors of our building in South Lake Union. The familiar hum of servers in the background and the soft clicking of keyboards always made me feel at home here. This place had been my sanctuary, my creative laboratory, and honestly, my entire professional identity since I'd graduated from the University of Washington with my computer science degree. My name is Sarah Chen, and at 28, I had somehow become the unofficial backbone of DataFlow Solutions' entire technical infrastructure. Not that anyone outside of our small engineering team really understood what that meant, but every single piece of software, every algorithm, every database optimization that made our company profitable had passed through my hands at some point over the past 4 years. DataFlow Solutions specialized in helping medium-sized businesses make sense of their customer data through predictive analytics and automated reporting. We weren't Google or Amazon, but we had carved out a profitable niche by being incredibly good at what we did and maintaining personal relationships with our clients. Our software could take messy, inconsistent data from multiple sources and transform it into clear, actionable insights that helped businesses increase their revenue and improve their customer experience. What made us special wasn't just our software, though. It was the custom integrations, the personalized algorithms, and the deep understanding of each client's unique business model that I had spent years developing and refining. Every client implementation was like solving a complex puzzle, and I had become exceptionally good at seeing patterns and creating solutions that others missed. The company had been founded 5 years earlier by David Rodriguez, a former Microsoft program manager who had the vision but needed technical talent to make it reality. When I joined as employee number 12, fresh out of college and eager to prove myself, DataFlow was struggling with a clunky, unreliable system that crashed regularly and frustrated both employees and clients. David had hired me as a junior developer, but within 6 months it became clear that I had an intuitive understanding of both the technical challenges and the business requirements that made our software valuable. While other developers focused on writing clean code, I was obsessing over performance optimization, user experience, and scalability issues that would matter as we grew. My first major contribution came during my 8th month at the company, when our primary database started failing under increased load from new client implementations. The senior developer at the time, Kevin Walsh, was convinced we needed to completely rebuild our data architecture, a project that would take months and potentially lose us several major clients who were already frustrated with performance issues. I spent an entire weekend at the office, surviving on energy drinks and determination, completely reimagining how we stored and accessed client data. Instead of a complete rebuild, I designed a hybrid approach that maintained compatibility with existing client systems while dramatically improving performance through better indexing, caching strategies, and query optimization. When I demonstrated the new system on Monday morning, showing a 60% improvement in processing speed and 90% reduction in crash incidents, David stared at the metrics in disbelief. Kevin grudgingly admitted that my solution was more elegant than his proposed rebuild, and from that moment, I became the go-to person for any technical challenge that seemed impossible to solve. Over the next 3 years, my role evolved organically from junior developer to lead architect to unofficial chief technology officer, even though my title never quite caught up with my responsibilities. I designed and implemented the core algorithms that made our predictive analytics accurate. I built the API framework that allowed seamless integration with over 40 different business software platforms. I created the automated testing suite that caught bugs before they reached clients. I developed the monitoring system that prevented outages and performance issues. Most importantly, I had built the relationships with our key clients that kept them loyal to DataFlow despite offers from larger competitors. When enterprise manufacturing had a critical deadline for their quarterly reporting, I personally worked through a weekend to customize their dashboard. When Pacific Retail needed a complex integration with their inventory management system, I designed a solution that saved them hundreds of thousands of dollars in operational efficiency. Every major client success story had my fingerprints all over it, but I never minded working behind the scenes. I loved the technical challenges, the problem solving, and the satisfaction of building something that created real value for people. David understood my contributions and compensated me accordingly, but more importantly, he gave me the creative freedom to innovate and the trust to make decisions that affected the entire company's technical direction. The culture at DataFlow was collaborative and respectful. Our engineering team was small but incredibly talented, and we had developed a rhythm of working together that felt more like a family than a typical corporate environment. We shared knowledge freely, celebrated each other's successes, and pulled together during challenging projects. I had mentored 3 junior developers who had grown into excellent engineers under my guidance, and I genuinely loved coming to work every day. Everything changed 6 months ago when David announced that he was stepping back from day-to-day operations to focus on business development and strategic partnerships. The company had grown to over 60 employees and was generating substantial revenue, but David felt we needed more experienced leadership to scale to the next level. He would remain as CEO and founder, but we needed a chief technology officer who could bring enterprise-level experience and help us compete with larger firms for Fortune 500 clients. The search for a CTO took several months, during which I essentially functioned in that role without the title. I managed the engineering roadmap, made hiring decisions, presented technical strategies to the board of directors, and continued to oversee all major client implementations. Several board members suggested promoting me to the CTO position permanently, but David felt we needed someone with more years of experience and a proven track record at larger companies. When Marcus Sterling was hired as our new CTO, I was cautiously optimistic. His resume was impressive, with 15 years of experience at major tech companies including stints at Oracle, IBM, and most recently as a VP of engineering at a Fortune 500 software company. He had an MBA from Wharton, in addition to his computer science background, and during his interview presentation, he demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of enterprise software architecture and scaling challenges. David introduced Marcus to the team during an all-hands meeting 2 weeks before his official start date. Marcus was tall, impeccably dressed, and spoke with the confident authority of someone accustomed to leading large teams and managing multi-million-dollar budgets. He talked about bringing best practices from enterprise environments, implementing more rigorous development processes, and positioning DataFlow to compete for larger contracts that could dramatically increase our revenue.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
During his presentation, Marcus outlined his 90-day plan for evaluating our current systems, identifying areas for improvement, and restructuring the engineering organization to support rapid growth. He spoke about code quality standards, automated deployment pipelines, and agile methodologies with the fluency of someone who had successfully implemented these changes before. I found myself impressed by his vision and excited about the possibility of learning from someone with his experience. Many of the processes he described were things I had been wanting to implement, but hadn't had the bandwidth to prioritize, while maintaining our existing systems and client commitments. Having a dedicated leader focused on organizational improvements would free me up to concentrate on the technical innovations that I was most passionate about. After his presentation, Marcus made a point of introducing himself to key team members individually. When he reached me, David mentioned that I was our lead architect and had been instrumental in building most of our core systems. Marcus shook my hand firmly and said he looked forward to understanding my work and discussing how we could leverage my expertise in his new organizational structure. The conversation was brief but professional, and I left the meeting feeling optimistic about working under his leadership. Finally, we would have someone who could handle the management and strategic aspects of technology leadership, while I focused on what I did best, building innovative solutions for complex problems. Over the following 2 weeks, I prepared extensively for Marcus's arrival. I documented our entire technical architecture, created detailed specifications for all our core systems, and compiled performance metrics and client feedback that demonstrated the value of our current approaches. I wanted to make his transition as smooth as possible and ensure he had all the information needed to make informed decisions about our technology direction. I also reached out to our key clients to let them know about the leadership transition and assure them that their implementations and support would continue seamlessly. Several clients expressed concerns about potential disruptions, but I was able to reassure them based on Marcus's impressive background and commitment to maintaining our high service standards. The weekend before Marcus's first official day, I came into the office to finish preparing a comprehensive presentation about our technical infrastructure. I wanted to give him a complete picture of not just what we had built, but why we had made specific architectural decisions, how those decisions had evolved over time, and what challenges and opportunities I saw for future development. The presentation covered everything from our database design and API architecture to our monitoring systems and client integration processes. I included case studies of successful client implementations, performance benchmarks that showed how our systems had scaled over time, and a roadmap of technical improvements that could support the company's growth objectives. I was genuinely excited to share this information with Marcus and begin collaborating on the next phase of DataFlow's technical evolution. After 4 years of building and refining these systems largely on my own, the prospect of having an experienced partner to help scale our capabilities felt like exactly what I needed to take my career to the next level. Monday morning arrived with typical Seattle drizzle, and I was at my desk early, reviewing my presentation one final time before Marcus's official welcome meeting. The engineering team was buzzing with anticipation, and several colleagues stopped by my desk to ask if I had any insights about what changes we might expect under new leadership. David had scheduled an all-hands meeting for 9 a.m. to officially welcome Marcus and outline his initial priorities. As employees filed into our main conference room, I noticed Marcus talking quietly with David and 2 members of our board of directors near the front of the room. He looked confident and well-prepared, exactly what you'd expect from an experienced executive on his first day at a new company. The meeting began with David reiterating his excitement about bringing Marcus on board and his confidence that this leadership change would position DataFlow for unprecedented growth. He spoke about the opportunities ahead of us and the importance of embracing change while maintaining the collaborative culture that had made us successful. Marcus then took the floor and delivered a polished presentation about his vision for our engineering organization. He talked about implementing industry-standard development practices, improving code quality through automated testing and peer review processes, and restructuring teams to eliminate redundancies and improve efficiency. Much of what he said made sense and aligned with improvements I had been advocating for internally. However, as his presentation continued, I began to notice that he was speaking about our current systems and processes in broad, generic terms that suggested he hadn't yet taken the time to understand the specific solutions we had developed or why they were effective for our clients. When he mentioned the need to eliminate legacy code and technical debt that was slowing down our development velocity, I felt a slight unease. Many of the systems he was likely categorizing as legacy code were actually carefully crafted solutions that I had developed to address specific client requirements and performance challenges. They might not follow the latest architectural trends, but they were stable, efficient, and deeply integrated with our clients' business processes. As the meeting concluded, Marcus announced that he would be conducting individual meetings with all engineering team members over the next week to understand their roles, assess their contributions, and discuss how they fit into his restructured organization. He emphasized that these conversations were opportunities for honest feedback and strategic planning, not performance reviews. I left the meeting feeling cautiously optimistic but slightly concerned about Marcus's apparent lack of familiarity with our existing systems. I reminded myself that it was unreasonable to expect him to fully understand 4 years of development history after just 2 weeks of preparation. The individual meetings would give him the opportunity to dive deeper into our technical architecture and understand the strategic decisions behind our current approaches. That afternoon, I received an email from Marcus's assistant scheduling my individual meeting for the following Monday morning at 8 a.m. The email was brief and professional, noting that I should prepare to discuss my current responsibilities major projects, and perspectives on organizational improvements. I spent the rest of the week refining my presentation and gathering additional documentation that would help Marcus understand the full scope of my contributions to the company. Over the weekend, I heard from several colleagues who had already had their meetings with Marcus. The feedback was mixed. Some junior developers reported positive conversations about career development and learning opportunities. However, 2 senior engineers mentioned that Marcus had asked pointed questions about redundant roles and overlapping responsibilities that made them wonder if he was planning significant organizational changes. Kevin Walsh, our former senior developer who had become a team lead, told me that Marcus had spent most of their meeting asking about our development processes and code quality standards, rather than discussing Kevin's specific projects or expertise. Kevin left the meeting feeling like Marcus was more interested in identifying problems than understanding existing strengths. Despite these concerning reports, I tried to maintain an optimistic outlook. Organizational change was always uncomfortable, and it was natural for an experienced executive to focus on areas for improvement, rather than simply celebrating existing successes. Marcus's track record suggested he knew how to build successful engineering organizations, and I trusted that his assessments would be based on thorough analysis, rather than superficial impressions. I arrived at the office early on Monday morning, well prepared for what I expected to be a detailed technical discussion about DataFlow's infrastructure and my role in its development. I had prepared a comprehensive overview of my work, including specific examples of client solutions, performance improvements, and strategic technical decisions that had contributed to the company's success. Marcus's office was located in the executive suite on the top floor of our building, a space I had rarely visited during my 4 years at the company. His assistant directed me to a conference room adjacent to his office, where Marcus was seated at the head of a polished table with a legal pad and laptop computer. He greeted me professionally and invited me to sit across from him. On the table in front of him, I noticed a folder with my name written on the tab, presumably containing my personnel file and performance reviews. Next to it was what appeared to be an organizational chart with various positions marked in different colors. "Thank you for meeting with me, Sarah," Marcus began, his tone businesslike but not unfriendly. "I've been spending the past week getting up to speed on our engineering organization and identifying opportunities for optimization and restructuring. As you know, my mandate is to scale our technical capabilities to support rapid growth and position us to compete for enterprise-level contracts." I nodded, expecting him to ask about my technical work or request a demonstration of the systems I had built. Instead, he consulted his notes and continued with what felt like a prepared speech. "Based on my analysis of our current structure and my experience with similar organizations, I've identified several areas where we can eliminate redundancies and streamline our development processes. One of the challenges in a company that has grown organically like DataFlow is that roles and responsibilities often overlap in ways that create inefficiencies and unclear accountability." As he spoke, I began to feel a growing sense of unease. His language was abstract and managerial, focused on organizational theory rather than technical reality. He wasn't asking about my work or seeking to understand my contributions. He was delivering conclusions that he had apparently reached without input from the people who actually built and maintained our systems. After reviewing our staffing levels and comparing them to industry benchmarks for companies of our size and revenue, Marcus continued, "I've determined that we have excess capacity in certain technical roles that can be consolidated or eliminated without impacting our delivery capabilities." The phrase excess capacity hit me like a physical blow. I realized with growing horror that Marcus was preparing to fire me, and he was doing it based on spreadsheet analysis rather than any understanding of what I actually did for the company. I interrupted him, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "Marcus, before you continue, I think there might be some misunderstanding about my role here. I'm not just another developer on the team. I build most of the core systems that generate revenue for this company. I design the algorithms, the database architecture, the client integration processes. I personally manage relationships with our largest clients." He looked at me with what appeared to be mild annoyance at being interrupted. "Sarah, I appreciate your passion for your work, but what I'm discussing is strategic organizational restructuring based on industry best practices and objective analysis. Individual attachment to legacy systems and processes is exactly the kind of thinking that prevents companies from scaling effectively. Legacy systems." He was calling 4 years of carefully crafted, battle-tested, revenue-generating code legacy systems that needed to be eliminated. The disconnection from reality was so profound that I momentarily wondered if we were talking about the same company. I tried a different approach, speaking more urgently now. Marcus, have you reviewed any of the technical documentation I prepared? Have you looked at our client satisfaction scores, our system performance metrics, our revenue attribution by technical component? The systems you're calling legacy are generating millions of dollars in annual recurring revenue. He glanced at his notes dismissively. Sarah, I understand that you're proud of the work you've done here, but my job is to make objective assessments based on scalability requirements and industry standards. What matters isn't what we've built in the past, but what we need to build for the future. And frankly, much of our current technical architecture appears to be the result of ad hoc decisions rather than strategic planning. Ad hoc decisions. 4 years of solving complex problems, optimizing performance, and creating value for clients was being dismissed as ad hoc decision-making by someone who had spent exactly 1 week reviewing our company and apparently 0 time understanding our technical systems. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, but it became increasingly clear that Marcus had already made his decision and was simply going through the motions of explaining it to me. He spoke about eliminating redundant positions, bringing in enterprise-level talent, and implementing modern development practices that would replace our current approaches. When I asked specifically which positions were being eliminated, he consulted his organizational chart and said that several senior technical roles would be consolidated under new leadership, and that my position as lead architect was being restructured out of the organization effective immediately. Effective immediately. I was being fired on Marcus Sterling's first official day as CTO by someone who didn't know what I had built, didn't understand how our systems worked, and hadn't taken the time to learn why our technical decisions had been successful. As he handed me a termination letter and explained the logistics of my departure, I sat there in stunned silence, trying to process the magnitude of what was happening. In the span of a 20-minute meeting, my 4-year career at DataFlow Solutions was ending because a new executive had decided I was redundant, based on organizational charts and industry benchmarks. The final insult came when Marcus mentioned that my departure would create opportunities for innovation and fresh perspectives that would benefit the entire engineering team. He spoke as if firing me was actually a favor to the company, removing an obstacle to progress rather than eliminating the person who had built the technical foundation that made progress possible. As I stood up to leave, Marcus offered what he probably thought was encouraging advice about leveraging my experience at DataFlow to find opportunities at other companies. He suggested that my hands-on technical background would be valuable in a smaller organization where my skills would be a better fit for the scope of technical challenges. In other words, he was telling me that I wasn't qualified to work at the successful company I had helped build, but that my experience there might make me suitable for lesser opportunities elsewhere. The condescension was breathtaking, made worse by the fact that he genuinely seemed to believe he was being helpful. I walked out of that conference room in a daze, carrying my termination letter and trying to understand how 4 years of building, creating, and contributing to a company's success could be erased so quickly by someone who knew nothing about what I had accomplished. But as I made my way back to my desk to collect my personal belongings, one thought began to crystallize in my mind with absolute clarity. Marcus Sterling had made the biggest mistake of his professional career. He had just fired the person who built and maintained every critical system that kept DataFlow Solutions profitable and operational. And he was about to discover exactly what that decision would cost him. The walk back to my desk felt surreal, like moving through a dream where everything looked familiar but nothing made sense anymore. My colleagues were arriving for their normal workday, grabbing coffee and settling into their routines, completely unaware that their lead architect had just been eliminated from the organization by a man who didn't understand what she had built. I sat down at my workstation, the same desk I had occupied for 4 years, surrounded by monitors displaying code I had written, system diagrams I had designed, and client dashboards that relied on infrastructure I had created. The irony was overwhelming. Marcus Sterling had just fired the architect of the very systems that would make or break his success as CTO, and he had done it with the confidence of someone who believed he was making a strategic improvement. My first instinct was to call David Rodriguez immediately and explain what had happened. Surely this was a misunderstanding that could be resolved once someone with actual knowledge of the company's technical operations understood the situation. David knew my value to the organization. He had relied on my expertise for years and had personally approved every major technical decision I had made. But as I reached for my phone, I hesitated. Marcus hadn't acted alone in making this decision. He had been hired specifically to make these kinds of organizational changes, and David had given him the authority to restructure the engineering team as he saw fit. If I went running to David the moment I was fired, it would look like I was undermining Marcus's authority and questioning David's judgment in hiring him. More importantly, I realized that this situation presented an opportunity to demonstrate something that words alone could never convey. Marcus Sterling was about to learn through direct experience why DataFlow Solutions had been successful, and what happened when critical technical expertise was removed from an organization without understanding its impact. Instead of making phone calls or sending emails, I decided to document everything. If Marcus believed that my departure would have no negative impact on the company's operations, then the best way to prove him wrong was to let reality speak for itself. I opened a new document and began creating a comprehensive record of every system, process, and client relationship that would be affected by my absence. The scope was staggering even to me as I laid it out systematically. DataFlow's core analytics engine relied on algorithms I had developed and refined over 3 years of client feedback and performance optimization. The database architecture used custom indexing strategies that I had implemented to handle our specific query patterns and data volumes. The API framework that allowed integration with client systems included dozens of custom connectors that I had built to accommodate unique requirements from major accounts. Our monitoring and alerting system was entirely my creation, designed to catch performance issues and potential outages before they affected clients. The automated backup and disaster recovery processes that protected our clients' data had been implemented and tested by me personally. The security protocols that protected sensitive customer information were based on my analysis of industry threats and compliance requirements. But the technical systems were only part of the picture. Over 4 years, I had developed deep relationships with key clients that went far beyond normal vendor-customer interactions. When Pacific Retail needed emergency support during their Black Friday sales period, they called me directly because they trusted my expertise and knew I would prioritize their success. When Enterprise Manufacturing faced a critical audit that required detailed data validation, they relied on my personal assurance that our analytics were accurate and defensible. These relationships had been crucial to DataFlow's growth and client retention. Our competitors might offer similar features or lower prices, but clients stayed with us because they trusted the people behind the technology. They knew that when problems arose, they could reach out to someone who understood both their business requirements and the technical details of how our systems met those needs. As I documented these relationships and dependencies, I began to understand the full magnitude of Marcus's error. He hadn't just eliminated a redundant position or consolidated overlapping responsibilities. He had removed the institutional knowledge and client trust that formed the foundation of DataFlow's competitive advantage in a crowded market. The termination letter specified that my access to company systems would be revoked at the end of the business day, and that I should complete any pending work and transfer responsibilities to other team members before leaving. The assumption seemed to be that my work consisted of discrete tasks that could be easily handed off to other developers with minimal disruption. I spent the next several hours creating detailed documentation of ongoing projects, system maintenance requirements, and client escalation procedures. But as I worked, I realized that much of what I did on a daily basis couldn't be transferred through documentation alone. The expertise I had developed was the result of years of experience with specific systems, deep understanding of client business processes, and intuitive knowledge of how all the pieces fit together. For example, our predictive analytics algorithms weren't just code that ran automatically. They required constant fine-tuning based on changing client data patterns, seasonal business variations, and evolving market conditions. I had developed a sense for when the algorithms were producing anomalous results and needed adjustment, often catching issues that would have gone unnoticed until clients complained about inaccurate forecasts. The database performance optimization that kept our systems running smoothly was similarly dependent on experience and intuition. I could tell from monitoring metrics when queries were starting to slow down due to increased data volume or changing usage patterns, and I knew which indexing adjustments or caching modifications would resolve the issues most effectively. These weren't skills that could be documented and transferred to other developers overnight. Most critically, the client relationships that had taken years to build couldn't be handed off to new team members through email introductions. Clients trusted me specifically because they had worked with me through multiple projects and knew that I understood their unique requirements and challenges. When they called with urgent issues or complex requests, they expected to speak with someone who had context about their business and could provide solutions quickly and efficiently. By midday, several colleagues had heard about my termination and stopped by my desk to express shock and confusion. Kevin Walsh was particularly upset, pointing out that he had just recommended me for a significant salary increase during his meeting with Marcus, emphasizing my critical role in maintaining client satisfaction and system stability. Emma Rodriguez, one of the junior developers I had mentored, was almost in tears as she asked how the team was supposed to handle complex client issues without my expertise. She had been working on a challenging integration project for one of our largest clients, and she relied on my guidance to navigate the technical and business requirements that made the project successful. Even Tom Bradley, our DevOps engineer, expressed concern about how system maintenance and optimization would be handled without my involvement. While he was responsible for server infrastructure and deployment processes, I had been the one who understood how our applications actually used that infrastructure and what performance characteristics were critical for client satisfaction. The consensus among my colleagues was that Marcus had made a serious error in judgment, but none of them felt comfortable challenging his decision directly. He was the new CTO, with an impressive background and the authority to restructure the organization as he saw fit. Questioning his decisions on his first day would be career-limiting for anyone who wanted to remain employed at DataFlow. As the afternoon progressed, I began to notice signs that my absence was already creating problems, even though I was still technically employed for a few more hours. A client called the main support line with a complex query about data discrepancies in their monthly reports, and the call was escalated through 3 different team members before someone realized that I was the only person who fully understood the custom calculations involved. Another client sent an urgent email about performance issues with their real-time dashboard during peak usage periods. The email was forwarded to me automatically because I had been designated as the primary technical contact for their account. When I explained that I was no longer able to provide support, the client expressed confusion and concern about who would handle their account going forward. Most telling was a call from Jennifer Martinez, the CTO of Pacific Retail, one of our largest and most important clients. She had been trying to reach me directly to discuss an expansion of our analytics platform to cover their new product lines. When my phone went to voicemail, she called the main office and was eventually transferred to Marcus Sterling himself. I wasn't present for that conversation, but Kevin Walsh overheard parts of it and filled me in later. Jennifer had expressed surprise that she was being transferred to someone new, since she had been working exclusively with me for over 2 years on all technical matters. When Marcus explained that he was the new CTO and would be handling strategic client relationships going forward, Jennifer apparently asked several detailed questions about our integration capabilities and data processing workflows. According to Kevin, Marcus had struggled to answer her questions with the specificity she expected, eventually promising to research the technical details and follow up with comprehensive answers. Jennifer had ended the call by requesting that I contact her directly to ensure continuity on her expansion project, clearly unaware that I had been terminated. This conversation illustrated perfectly the disconnect between Marcus's perception of organizational efficiency and the reality of how DataFlow's client relationships actually functioned. He assumed that CTO-level strategic discussions could be separated from technical implementation details, but our clients valued us precisely because we combined strategic thinking with deep technical expertise in every interaction. As my final day at DataFlow drew to a close, I completed my documentation and sent detailed transition notes to the colleagues who would be inheriting various aspects of my responsibilities. But I also began implementing a more subtle strategy that would help demonstrate the true value of what Marcus had eliminated. I had spent 4 years building monitoring and alerting systems that caught problems before they became crises. These systems sent notifications to my personal email and phone, allowing me to address issues quickly even when I wasn't actively working. Since my personal contact information was embedded throughout the monitoring infrastructure, I would continue to receive alerts about system problems even after my employment ended. I also realized that many of our client escalation procedures routed urgent issues to my personal phone number, since clients had learned that calling me directly was the fastest way to get complex problems resolved. While I would no longer be able to provide support, I would be aware of every client crisis that arose, and could observe how the remaining team handled situations that had previously been my responsibility. Most importantly, I had admin-level access to many of the systems I had built, access that was tied to my personal authentication credentials rather than generic company accounts. While I would never use this access maliciously, its existence meant that certain critical maintenance tasks simply couldn't be performed without my involvement, or a significant effort to recreate the access rights and system permissions I had established. In my final hours at the office, I made sure to properly log out of all company systems and return my badge and equipment as required. But I also ensured that my personal monitoring setup would continue to function, providing me with real-time visibility into how DataFlow's infrastructure performed without my oversight. As I walked out of the DataFlow Solutions building for what I thought might be the last time, carrying a small box of personal items from my desk, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and anticipation. I was genuinely heartbroken to leave the company I had helped build and the colleagues I had worked with for 4 years. But I was also curious to see how long it would take for Marcus Sterling to realize the magnitude of his mistake. I didn't have to wait long for the first signs of trouble. My phone started buzzing with system alerts before I even reached my car in the parking garage. The first notification was from our primary database server, indicating that query response times were starting to degrade during the afternoon peak usage period. Under normal circumstances, I would have immediately logged in to check the query execution plans and adjust indexing or caching parameters to resolve the issue. Instead, I simply noted the time and severity of the alert, curious to see how the remaining team would handle a problem that I had typically resolved within minutes. The second alert came 20 minutes later, indicating that the performance issue was worsening and starting to affect client dashboard load times. By the time I arrived home, I had received 6 different alerts covering database performance, API response times, and client connection failures. These weren't catastrophic outages, but they represented exactly the kind of gradual degradation that I had spent years preventing through proactive monitoring and quick intervention. I opened my laptop and checked the client support portal to see if anyone had reported problems. Sure enough, 3 different clients had submitted tickets about slow dashboard performance, and 2 more had called the support line to ask if there were known issues with the system. Under normal circumstances, I would have already identified and resolved the underlying problem before most clients even noticed there was an issue. My phone rang as I was reviewing the support tickets. The caller ID showed Kevin Walsh's number, and I could hear stress in his voice before he even started speaking. "Sarah, thank God you answered. We've got some kind of performance issue affecting multiple clients, and nobody can figure out what's causing it. The monitoring system is sending alerts, but the error messages don't make sense to anyone else." I felt a twinge of guilt as I realized that my colleagues were struggling with problems that I could have solved easily. These were good people who didn't deserve to suffer because of Marcus's poor decision-making. But I also recognized that helping them now would only enable Marcus's belief that my departure had no negative consequences. "Kevin," I said carefully, "I understand this is frustrating, but I'm no longer employed by DataFlow. You need to escalate this through the proper channels to Marcus or whoever he's designated to handle technical issues. I can't provide support for systems that are no longer my responsibility." There was a pause, and then Kevin's voice became more urgent. "Sarah, I tried calling Marcus, but he's in meetings for the rest of the day. Tom is looking at the server metrics, but he doesn't understand the application-level performance tuning that you always handled. Emma tried to run some of your diagnostic scripts, but she's getting permission errors. The permission errors didn't surprise me. Many of the diagnostic and optimization tools I had developed over the years were tied to my specific user account and administrative privileges. I had been planning to transfer these tools to shared service accounts, but that project had been postponed while I focused on client deliverables. Kevin, I repeated. I sympathize with the situation, but this is exactly why companies have procedures for knowledge transfer and system documentation. Marcus will need to work with the team to understand how these systems function and establish new processes for handling technical issues. After I hung up, I felt terrible about leaving my former colleagues to struggle with problems I could solve, but I also recognized that this was an inevitable consequence of eliminating critical expertise from an organization. Marcus had assumed that technical knowledge was easily replaceable, and he was about to learn through direct experience why that assumption was wrong. Over the next several hours, the alerts continued to accumulate. Database performance continued to degrade, causing cascade effects throughout the entire system. API response times increased to the point where client integrations started timing out and failing. The automated reporting processes that generated daily analytics for clients began producing incomplete results due to query timeouts. By 8 p.m., according to the alerts I was receiving, DataFlow was experiencing the worst system performance crisis in over 2 years. Multiple clients had called to report problems, and the support team was struggling to provide answers or estimated resolution times. According to the timestamps on support tickets, the average response time for client issues had increased from my typical 15-minute resolution to over 2 hours with no resolution in sight. My phone rang again, this time showing David Rodriguez's number. I debated whether to answer, knowing that this conversation would be difficult for both of us. David had been a mentor and friend, and I didn't want our relationship to be damaged by the circumstances of my departure. "Sarah," David said when I picked up, his voice tense with stress. "I know this is awkward given what happened today, but we have a serious situation developing with our systems. Kevin tells me that you might have insights that could help us resolve some performance issues." "David," I replied gently, "I appreciate that you're dealing with a crisis, but Marcus was very clear that my position was redundant and that my departure would not impact the company's operational capabilities. It would be inappropriate for me to second-guess his assessment by providing emergency support." There was a long silence before David spoke again. "Sarah, I think there may have been some miscommunication about your role and the impact of organizational changes. Would you be willing to come in tomorrow morning to discuss the situation with Marcus and me? I think we need to reassess some decisions." I considered his request carefully. Part of me wanted to rush back to the office and fix the problems that were affecting clients and stressing my former colleagues. But I also realized that doing so would validate Marcus's approach to organizational management and prevent him from learning the lessons that his poor decision-making had created. "David," I said finally, "I'm willing to discuss the situation, but not as an emergency response to system problems. If Marcus wants to understand the value of the expertise he eliminated, then he needs to experience the full consequences of that decision. Once the current crisis is resolved through whatever means he considers appropriate, I'm happy to have a strategic conversation about DataFlow's technical architecture and organizational needs." After ending the call with David, I spent the evening monitoring the situation remotely while researching job opportunities at other companies. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was watching DataFlow struggle with problems I could solve, while simultaneously preparing to take my expertise to a competitor who would appreciate its value. The system alerts continued throughout the night, indicating that the performance issues were worsening rather than improving. By morning, I had received over 40 notifications covering everything from database timeouts to complete service failures for several client integrations. According to the support portal, DataFlow had received more client complaints in 12 hours than they typically received in an entire month. My phone started ringing at 6 a.m., with calls from colleagues who were either seeking emergency help or updating me on the deteriorating situation. I let most of the calls go to voicemail, but the messages painted a picture of an organization in crisis, struggling to understand and resolve problems that had never been allowed to develop under my oversight. Emma Rodriguez left a particularly distressing message, explaining that she had been at the office since midnight, trying to resolve client issues, but every solution she attempted seemed to create new problems. Tom Bradley reported that he had restarted servers multiple times, but the performance issues kept returning because the underlying application problems hadn't been addressed. Most tellingly, Kevin Walsh called to say that 3 major clients had threatened to terminate their contracts if service wasn't restored immediately. Pacific Retail had escalated their concerns to David personally, demanding answers about why their mission-critical analytics were failing during one of their busiest sales periods. By Tuesday morning, Marcus Sterling was learning a harsh lesson about the difference between organizational theory and operational reality. The person he had dismissed as redundant based on industry benchmarks and efficiency analysis had actually been the linchpin holding together DataFlow's entire technical operation. But this was only the beginning of his education. The immediate performance crisis was just the most visible symptom of a much deeper problem. Over the coming days and weeks, Marcus would discover that my departure had created gaps in client relationships, institutional knowledge, and technical capability that couldn't be filled by hiring new developers or implementing better processes. The foundation of DataFlow Solutions had been built on expertise, relationships, and deep understanding of both technology and business requirements. Marcus had assumed that these intangible assets could be replaced with more efficient organizational structures and industry-standard practices. He was about to discover how wrong that assumption could be, and how much it could cost a company when critical expertise walked out the door. The real education was just beginning, and Marcus Sterling was about to receive the most expensive lesson of his professional career. Wednesday morning brought the call I had been expecting since Marcus Sterling first handed me that termination letter. David Rodriguez's voice was strained with exhaustion when he reached me at 7:30 a.m., clearly having spent another sleepless night dealing with the cascading crisis that had engulfed DataFlow Solutions. "Sarah, we need to talk," he said without preamble. "Can you come in this morning? Marcus wants to meet with both of us to discuss the current situation and explore options for moving forward." I had spent Tuesday evening preparing for this conversation, knowing that Marcus would eventually be forced to acknowledge the connection between my departure and the company's sudden operational collapse. The system monitoring alerts on my phone had continued throughout the night, documenting a litany of failures that painted a clear picture of an organization struggling to maintain basic functionality without critical expertise. The most recent alert had arrived at 6 a.m., indicating that the automated backup process for client data had failed completely, leaving several major accounts without the data protection they were contractually guaranteed. This wasn't just a performance issue anymore. DataFlow was now potentially in breach of service-level agreements that could result in significant financial penalties and legal liability. I agreed to meet with David and Marcus at 9 a.m., giving myself time to review the comprehensive documentation I had been maintaining since my termination. Every system alert, every client complaint, every failure and service degradation had been carefully logged with timestamps and technical details. If Marcus wanted to understand the impact of his organizational restructuring, I was prepared to provide him with irrefutable evidence. The lobby of DataFlow Solutions felt different when I arrived Wednesday morning. The usual energy and optimism that had characterized the company culture was replaced by an atmosphere of stress and crisis management. Through the glass walls, I could see colleagues huddled around computers, their faces reflecting the strain of dealing with problems they didn't fully understand. Emma Rodriguez spotted me as I waited for the elevator and rushed over with relief written across her face. "Sarah, thank God you're here. Please tell me you're coming back to fix this nightmare. We've been working around the clock, but everything we try just makes things worse." The desperation in her voice was heartbreaking. Emma was a talented developer who had learned quickly under my mentoring, but she had never been exposed to the kind of complex system administration and performance optimization that was now required to restore stability. None of the remaining team members had, because I had always handled those responsibilities before problems became visible to others. "I'm here for a meeting with David and Marcus," I told her gently. "But Emma, you need to understand that I'm no longer an employee of this company. Whatever decisions are made about resolving these issues will have to come from your current leadership." Her face fell as she realized that my presence didn't necessarily mean immediate relief from the crisis they were experiencing. The elevator arrived, and I rode up to the executive floor with a growing sense of anticipation about the conversation that was about to unfold. Marcus Sterling's office door was open when I arrived, and I could see him pacing behind his desk while speaking urgently into his phone. His usually immaculate appearance showed signs of stress, with his tie loosened and his shirt wrinkled from what had obviously been a long night. When he noticed me in the doorway, he quickly ended his call and invited me to sit in the same conference room where he had terminated my employment just 2 days earlier. David joined us a few minutes later, carrying a stack of printouts that I recognized as client complaint reports and system error logs. His usual calm demeanor was replaced by visible anxiety as he set the documents on the table and looked at me with something approaching desperation. "Sarah," David began, "I want to start by acknowledging that there seems to have been a significant miscommunication about the scope of your role and the potential impact of organizational changes. We're currently facing challenges that suggest our assessment of redundant positions may have been incorrect." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly unhappy with David's characterization of the situation as a miscommunication rather than a strategic decision that had backfired spectacularly. However, he remained silent as David continued outlining the severity of the problems they were confronting. "Since Monday evening, we've experienced system performance issues that have affected every major client account. Our support team has been overwhelmed with complaints about slow response times, failed integrations, and incomplete data processing. 3 clients have already indicated they may terminate their contracts if service isn't restored immediately." David consulted his notes before continuing with even more serious concerns. "We've also discovered that several critical maintenance processes have failed, including our automated backup systems and security monitoring protocols. Our compliance officer is concerned that we may be in violation of data protection agreements that could expose us to significant legal liability. The financial implications are becoming severe," David added, his voice growing more strained. "We've had to offer service credits to affected clients. And our sales team reports that 2 major prospects have postponed contract negotiations until they can be assured of our operational stability. If these issues aren't resolved quickly, we're looking at potential revenue losses in the hundreds of thousands of dollars." Marcus finally spoke, his tone carefully controlled but clearly reflecting frustration with the situation he found himself managing. "Sarah, I'll admit that the timing of these technical issues coinciding with your departure has created some challenges that we didn't anticipate. However, I want to understand from your perspective what specific knowledge or capabilities might be relevant to resolving the current problems." His phrasing was telling. Even now, facing a crisis that was directly attributable to his decision to eliminate my position, Marcus was framing the conversation in terms of temporary consulting, rather than acknowledging the fundamental error in his assessment. He was still operating under the assumption that technical problems could be solved through better processes and more efficient resource allocation. I pulled out my laptop and opened the comprehensive documentation I had prepared, including the detailed logs of system alerts and failure patterns that had occurred since my termination. The scope of the information I had maintained was immediately apparent to both David and Marcus as I displayed timeline charts showing the correlation between my departure and the degradation of system performance. "Marcus," I said, looking directly at him across the conference table, "before we discuss solutions, I think it's important that you understand exactly what has happened to DataFlow's technical infrastructure since Monday afternoon. The problems you're experiencing aren't random technical failures or coincidental timing issues. They're the predictable result of removing institutional knowledge and expertise from complex systems without understanding the dependencies involved." I walked them through each category of failures, explaining not just what had gone wrong, but why these problems had never occurred before, and what specific expertise was required to prevent and resolve them. The database performance issues stemmed from query optimization strategies that I had developed and maintained based on deep understanding of client usage patterns and data characteristics. The API integration failures reflected custom configuration settings that I had implemented to accommodate specific client requirements that weren't documented in standard system specifications. Most critically, the monitoring and alerting systems that had prevented minor issues from becoming major crises were configured to route notifications to my personal contact information and relied on my experience to interpret and respond to early warning signs. Without that human expertise analyzing and acting on system alerts, problems that would normally be resolved within minutes were escalating into major service outages. The backup failures were particularly serious because they reflected security and compliance protocols that I had personally implemented and tested. The automated systems relied on authentication credentials and administrative privileges that were tied to my user account, and transferring those capabilities to other team members required careful planning and coordination that hadn't occurred before my departure. As I presented this information, I watched Marcus's expression change from defensive frustration to growing comprehension of the magnitude of his miscalculation. David was taking notes furiously, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated his understanding of the technical and business implications of what I was describing. The most damaging revelation came when I showed them the client communication logs I had been monitoring. Pacific Retail had sent increasingly urgent messages about their analytics platform failures, culminating in a formal notice that they were considering termination of their contract unless service was restored within 24 hours. Enterprise Manufacturing had documented their compliance concerns in writing, creating a legal paper trail that could be used against DataFlow if their data protection requirements weren't met. Most significantly, Jennifer Martinez from Pacific Retail had sent a detailed email to David personally, expressing her shock and disappointment that I was no longer available to support their account without any advance notice or transition planning. She had specifically mentioned that her company's confidence in DataFlow was based largely on their relationship with me and their trust in my technical expertise. This email revealed something that Marcus clearly hadn't considered in his organizational analysis. Client retention at DataFlow wasn't just based on the functionality of our software or the competitive pricing of our contracts. It was fundamentally dependent on relationships and trust that had been built over years of reliable service and expert support. When I was eliminated from the organization, those relationships were severed without any strategy for maintaining client confidence and satisfaction. Marcus was quiet for several minutes after I finished my presentation, clearly processing the implications of what he had learned. When he finally spoke, his tone had shifted significantly from the confident executive authority he had displayed during our termination meeting. "Sarah," he said slowly, "I think it's clear that I underestimated the scope of your contributions and the potential impact of organizational restructuring. Given the current situation, I'd like to discuss the possibility of reinstating your position and working together to resolve these operational challenges." The offer wasn't surprising, but the way it was framed revealed that Marcus still didn't fully grasp the depth of his error. He was treating this as a negotiation to bring back a valuable employee, rather than an acknowledgement that he had made a fundamental mistake in judgment that had damaged the company and undermined client relationships. "Marcus," I replied carefully, "I appreciate the offer, but I think we need to address some broader issues before discussing my potential return to DataFlow. The problems you're experiencing aren't just technical issues that can be resolved by bringing me back for a few weeks to fix systems and restore service. They reflect fundamental gaps in your understanding of how this organization actually functions and what creates value for our clients." I leaned forward, making sure I had his full attention before continuing. "You eliminated my position based on organizational charts and industry benchmarks without taking the time to understand what I actually contributed to this company's success. You assumed that technical expertise was easily replaceable and that client relationships were transferable through email introductions and documentation handoffs." The silence in the room was absolute as I outlined the implications of his approach to leadership and decision-making. "You didn't just fire an employee on Monday, Marcus. You removed 4 years of institutional knowledge, severed relationships with major clients, and eliminated capabilities that can't be rebuilt quickly or easily. The crisis you're managing now is just the beginning of the problems that approach will create." David was nodding as I spoke, clearly recognizing the accuracy of my assessment. Marcus remained quiet, but I could see him struggling with the realization that his confident decision-making had been based on incomplete information and flawed assumptions. I continued with the most important point I wanted to make clear. If I were to return to DataFlow, it couldn't be as a temporary consultant brought in to clean up a crisis and then dismissed again when things stabilized. It would require fundamental changes in how technical expertise is valued and how organizational decisions are made. More importantly, it would require rebuilding client trust that has been damaged by the perception that DataFlow doesn't prioritize the relationships and expertise that clients depend on. Marcus asked what specific changes I would require, and I was ready with a detailed response that I had been formulating since Monday evening. First, any organizational restructuring would need to be based on thorough analysis of actual roles and contributions, rather than theoretical frameworks and industry comparisons. Second, client-facing technical experts would need to be involved in strategic planning to ensure that business decisions considered operational requirements and client impact. Most importantly, I explained, there would need to be clear recognition that technical expertise and client relationships represent core business assets that require long-term investment and protection. The idea that experienced technical staff could be eliminated and replaced without significant risk to business operations was fundamentally flawed and couldn't be allowed to guide future decision-making. The conversation continued for over an hour as we discussed specific terms and expectations for my potential return. Marcus asked detailed questions about system recovery priorities and timeline estimates for restoring full operational capability. David focused on client communication strategies and damage control measures that could preserve important business relationships. But the most significant moment came when Marcus directly acknowledged the scope of his error in judgment. "Sarah," he said, looking directly at me with what appeared to be genuine humility, "I clearly made a serious mistake in my assessment of your role and value to this organization. I let my confidence in organizational theory override the need to understand the specific context and requirements of DataFlow's technical operations." He paused before continuing with what felt like a difficult admission. "I assumed that my experience at larger companies had prepared me to make quick decisions about efficiency and redundancy, without recognizing that every organization has unique characteristics that require careful analysis. I should have spent more time understanding what you had built before making changes that affected critical business functions." This acknowledgement was important, but I wanted to ensure that the lessons learned extended beyond just my specific situation. "Marcus," I said, "the broader issue is that technical expertise often looks invisible to people who don't understand the complexity involved in building and maintaining systems. The work I do might seem like routine maintenance and support, but it actually requires deep knowledge of business requirements, technical architecture, and client relationships that takes years to develop." I gestured toward the stack of error reports and client complaints on the table. When that expertise is removed without understanding its value, the consequences can be severe and difficult to recover from. What's happened over the past 2 days could have been avoided if the decision-making process had included input from people who understood the technical and client dependencies involved. David spoke up to emphasize the financial implications of the situation. "We've calculated that the service credits, potential contract penalties, and lost business opportunities from this crisis could cost us over $300,000 in the next quarter alone. That doesn't include the longer-term damage to our reputation and client relationships that could affect revenue for years." These numbers provided a stark illustration of the real cost of Marcus's organizational efficiency initiative. In trying to eliminate what he perceived as redundant expenses, he had created problems that would cost the company far more than my annual salary and benefits. The pursuit of short-term cost savings had resulted in a crisis that threatened the company's long-term viability. After extensive discussion about recovery priorities and organizational changes, we reached an agreement for my return to DataFlow, with significantly enhanced authority and compensation. But more importantly, we established new processes for organizational planning that would prevent similar problems in the future. Any proposed changes to technical staff would require detailed impact analysis, including input from affected team members and assessment of client relationship implications. Major organizational decisions would include evaluation periods that allowed for testing and adjustment before full implementation. And technical expertise would be represented in strategic planning discussions to ensure that business decisions considered operational requirements and capabilities. The immediate priority was stabilizing DataFlow's technical infrastructure and restoring client confidence. But the longer-term goal was building an organization that valued expertise and relationships as core business assets, rather than treating them as replaceable commodities. Over the following weeks, I worked systematically to resolve the technical issues that had accumulated during my brief absence, while also rebuilding client relationships that had been damaged by the service disruptions. The process was more complex than simply fixing broken systems, because clients needed reassurance that the problems they had experienced wouldn't recur. Pacific Retail required a detailed technical review and written guarantees about service-level agreements before they would withdraw their contract termination notice. Enterprise Manufacturing demanded regular status updates and direct access to senior technical staff to ensure their compliance requirements were being met. Several other clients negotiated enhanced support terms and service credits as conditions for maintaining their relationships with DataFlow. Marcus participated actively in client recovery efforts, personally calling major accounts to acknowledge the service problems and outline the steps being taken to prevent future issues. These conversations were clearly difficult for him, as he had to admit that organizational changes had created the problems clients had experienced. But I was impressed by his willingness to take responsibility and work collaboratively on solutions, rather than deflecting blame or minimizing the impact of his decisions. The crisis had clearly been a learning experience that changed his approach to leadership and decision-making in ways that would benefit the organization long-term. The technical recovery process took nearly a month to complete fully, as some of the failed systems required careful reconstruction of data and configuration settings that had been lost during the crisis. However, the client relationship recovery took significantly longer, as trust that had been damaged needed to be rebuilt through consistent performance and reliable service over time. 6 months later, DataFlow had not only recovered from the crisis, but had actually strengthened its market position by demonstrating its commitment to client relationships and technical excellence. The organizational changes that emerged from the crisis created a more collaborative and strategically focused company that was better positioned for sustainable growth. Marcus had evolved into an effective CTO who understood the value of technical expertise and the importance of client relationships in building a successful technology company. Our working relationship became genuinely collaborative, combining his strategic and business development experience with my technical knowledge and client focus. Most importantly, the crisis had established clear principles about how DataFlow valued its people and expertise. Technical staff were recognized as critical business assets whose knowledge and relationships contributed directly to client satisfaction and revenue generation. Organizational decisions were made through inclusive processes that considered multiple perspectives and potential impacts. The lesson that emerged from this experience extended far beyond DataFlow Solutions. In technology companies especially, the expertise and relationships that drive success often look invisible to people who focus primarily on organizational charts and efficiency metrics. But when that expertise is removed without understanding its value, the consequences can be swift, severe, and very expensive to correct. Marcus Sterling learned that effective leadership in technical organizations requires deep understanding of how expertise creates value and how relationships drive client loyalty. Assumptions about redundancy and replaceability can be catastrophically wrong when they're based on superficial analysis rather than careful investigation of actual roles and contributions. For me, the experience reinforced the importance of documenting and communicating the value of technical work in terms that business leaders can understand and appreciate. Expertise becomes truly valuable when it's recognized and protected as a strategic asset, rather than treated as a replaceable commodity. The crisis at DataFlow also highlighted how quickly complex technical systems can degrade when critical expertise is removed, and how difficult it can be to recover from problems that could have been easily prevented. The cost of replacing institutional knowledge and rebuilding client relationships far exceeded any short-term savings that might have been achieved through organizational restructuring. But perhaps most importantly, the experience demonstrated that standing up for your professional value and refusing to accept dismissive treatment can lead to better outcomes than quietly accepting poor decisions. By allowing Marcus to experience the full consequences of his choices rather than immediately rescuing him from the crisis, I created an opportunity for learning and change that benefited everyone involved. 2 years later, I was promoted to Chief Technology Officer when Marcus moved into a business development role that better matched his strengths and interests. DataFlow had grown significantly under our collaborative leadership, and the lessons learned from our initial crisis had created a stronger, more resilient organization. The company culture now explicitly values expertise and relationships as core business assets, and our decision-making processes ensure that technical considerations are fully integrated with business strategy. New employees are mentored carefully to develop both technical skills and client relationship capabilities, creating depth and redundancy that prevents any single person from becoming irreplaceable. Looking back, Marcus's decision to fire me on his first day had been the catalyst for positive changes that made DataFlow a better company for everyone involved. His willingness to learn from his mistakes and work collaboratively on solutions had transformed what could have been a career-ending crisis into an opportunity for growth and improvement. The experience taught all of us that true organizational efficiency comes from understanding and leveraging the expertise and relationships that create value, not from eliminating them based on theoretical frameworks and superficial analysis. Building successful technology companies requires recognizing that people, knowledge, and trust are the most important assets any organization can possess. Sometimes the most valuable lessons come from the most difficult experiences, And sometimes the people who challenge us the most end up teaching us the most about ourselves and our capabilities. Marcus Sterling's first-day mistake became the foundation for a stronger partnership and a more successful company than either of us could have imagined when we first sat across from each other in that conference room. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.